Another deontologist, instead of going to reason that everybody has like a piece of software on smartphones all across the land or all laptops having a Windows operating system, instead of having that sort of piece of software, this notion of reason in our heads, well, W.D. Ross says that no, we may have reason like Kant talks about, but we may not. We can't be sure necessarily. But what we do have that we can be sure of is everybody has this notion of intuition. This is the notion, like some people talk about, moral conscience. Like when people say, I didn't do it because I knew I'd feel guilty if I did it. They're talking, it's like that knowing that one will feel guilty. Or just knowing, like this instantaneous, I'm like, okay, is it okay for me to steal? And then just knowing, no, it's not okay to steal. it's like this immediate, answer, like yes, no, or either maybe it's neutral, and that is a similar sort of idea as Kant, in that it would be Ross, just like Kant, thinks that every human being, instead of necessarily having Kant's version of reason program in their head, instead what every human being has, every rational, willing, autonomous moral agent, at least every person, what they have in their head is a little piece of software. Sometimes people talk about it's a gut feeling or it's an intuition that tells them what to do. And as long as they're doing whatever that little moral compass inside their mind is telling them to do, then they're acting morally, assuming that their moral compass isn't bent or broken in some kind of way, assuming that they have a sort of proper intuition. And well, what would proper intuition be? Well, according to Ross, who is a deontologist, your intuition, if it's functioning properly, will guide you in behavior that is respectful to others. It'll always guide you in a respectful direction. You will just know what would be more or less respectful to do to other of your equals, other persons, other rational, willing, autonomous agents. You will know that stealing is wrong. Why? Because it would be disrespectful to others of my own, like me, people who are also rational, that are also willing, that are also autonomous. Stealing against myself or stealing against others would be disrespectful. And how do we learn that? Is the intuition just informs us. It doesn't ask our permission. This is how it's objective, in that we don't get to pick and choose what our intuitions tells us, but we don't have to obey it either. You see, that's the thing to keep in mind about both Ross and Kant. They are not saying that Kant is not saying that when reason tells us what the right thing to do is, and when Ross says intuition tells us what the right thing to do is, neither theorist, Ross or Kant, is saying that we have to obey. We could choose not to obey what reason tells us or what intuition tells us. But if we don't obey it, that's when we've acted badly. You see, we will not have acted in accordance with our duty to, obey reason or obey intuition. And in turn, reason and intuition is always hammering on us to give other persons the respect that befits their personhood. And so to act in accordance with one's duties essentially means to obey reason or intuition, to obey our moral reason or our moral intuition. And so as long as we're doing that, we're moral. But we can choose not to. We can choose to do. What it amounts to with like Ross's intuition is that we know the better course of action. We can choose the worst course, but we always know the better course. It's just written into the software of our brain, to use this computer and software analogy. It's like it'd be a similar thing to like the calculator program on, like, say, smartphones across the land, or operating systems across all computers, is that it's built in that things like arithmetic with 2 plus 2 is 4, that 4, the calculator program generates 4. It's always going to generate 4, assuming Peano's axiom-based arithmetic it is, at least. There's other kinds of arithmetic, by the way. But Peano's is the one we use. Or an arithmetic system based on Peano style axioms of the system. And but the idea is that every calculator is going to generate 4. And so it would be possible to say that, yes, every calculator just knows that 2 plus 2 is 4. It just knows that 2 plus 3 is 5. That would be the way it works with intuition or reason. In this case, though, with the intuition, is that if we ask our intuition, is it okay for me to make this false promise? Ross is going to say, one's moral intuition, when properly functioning, is going to say, no, that's disrespectful. It's bad to do. You don't do that. And Ross comes up with like other sort of fundamental duties that our intuition is supposed to align with to give us a better feel for like, okay, so what does respect actually involve? What would it mean to respect persons? How's our intuition kind of parsing that across different scenarios? Well, we have duties. Our intuition is supposedly going to hover around these 7 or so duties. There could be more, but these are like the 7 big ones. And so the very first one, in the way I've listed them out here, is like non-maleficence. And so what does that mean? It's like a duty to not harm or injure other persons. It's like our intuition, anytime we ask intuition, is it okay to do this? Well, the first thing it's going to do is test. Well, does it harm someone? Is this going to cause an injury to other people? Like, is it going? And because harming or injuring someone, intentionally doing that is typically disrespectful. Like if we hurt someone, if we intend to hurt someone like I intend to hit Bob in the eye because I'm angry, well then that's not respectful to Bob. Even if Bob was disrespecting me, that doesn't necessarily entitle me to disrespect Bob in return. Because intuition would supposedly let me just know that that's the way it works. That just because someone disrespects me, it doesn't necessarily mean that I disrespect them in turn. You know, that especially when the prime sort of duty is to always respect. Yeah. And then the next one is like fidelity. So fidelity would be like duties to speak the truth, pay back debts, to keep our promises and other agreements. Like fidelity is like a duty to be truthful. Then remember, with autonomy, it depends on having the freedom to not be coerced, or freedom from coercion, freedom from manipulation, freedom to make good informed decisions. Well, the only way a person can make a good informed decision is to have truth, to have the actual data, the actual positives, the actual possible negatives, so they can weigh those things and decide, okay, they need accurate data in order to make an informed decision. We can't make an informed decision based on bad data. Or we can be informed, but we have a false information. And so it would be a bad decision. Or it would be an uninformed decision. Informed decisions imply that the truth is there. And so, in order to be respectful to the autonomy of another person, we don't lie to them. We try to tell truths rather than falsehoods. Another duty that Ross talks about that our intuition, kind of operates with is reparation. Like, that's the duty to set right any wrongs that we've done, to set things right, to make amends. Like, if our actions, if we're dealing with a world of other rational, autonomous, willing, moral agents, then we happen to make a mistake. Like we do something that actually does disrespect a person, and we didn't intend for it to happen, well, then we need to apologize. It's like the apology is the respectfulness. Even if we fall in a foul, like we accidentally, someone was disrespected due to our action, we should try to make that right. Intuition will tell us, or it will test our decisions based off of, is this a case of you trying to make right a previous wrong? If so, well, then that's a good thing. You do that. Gratitude. Saying thank you. Demonstrating an appreciation for the efforts another rational, willing, autonomous agent has done for you or yours. That's also something Ross thinks, that our intuition, this little moral intuition, this moral compass, this gut feeling that enables us to just know what right and wrong is it pays attention to, like, is the thing you're contemplating doing a way of showing gratitude to someone? If it is, well, then that's a good thing. Justice is another thing it pays attention to. Are we being fair in our dealings with other rational, willing, autonomous agents, other persons? Are we giving them their due based off of the merit of what they've done? Are we distributing our goods and resources to other people based off of merit? Like, if they earn it, we give it to them. If they don't earn it, we don't have to give it to them. But if they do earn it, we're certainly supposed to give it to them. That is the way, the justice part of intuition supposedly works. And then beneficence. It's to improve the conditions of others. It's like anytime we ask our intuition, would it be okay to, say, help people who are struggling after a big hurricane or after, any sort of natural disaster? Would it be okay to do that? Ross would wager that most everyone's little moral intuition is going to be like, it's certainly not wrong to try to help people in need. His sort of, the way Ross kind of understands intuition is that being beneficent, being kind to others, helping those when they need a little help, that is one of the true marks of respectful behavior to other persons, rational, willing, autonomous moral agents, is being beneficent. That our intuition will never say, oh yeah, that's bad, you shouldn't help those in need. Our intuition may not always tell us, yeah, you have to help others in need. It may not do that, but it may very well tell us that it's never going to be wrong to do so. That it's never going to be wrong if another person is struggling. Our intuition supposedly would tell us that it's never wrong to help that person if we so choose to do so or are able to do so. That you're never going to do something wrong by trying to help them. That's the idea. If your intent and motive, your will, is to help, then that's not going to be a bad thing. And then self-improvement, like duties to, given that we ourselves are rational, willing, autonomous agents, we're persons, that Ross would think our intuition would tell us that, say we were wondering, would it be okay to, say, go to school more, to learn more, to do, more exercise, to do these various things that are towards self-improvement. Like, trying to learn how to do something that we don't know how to do, or learning how to help others more effectively. Things like that. If we ask our intuition, Ross is going to say, our intuition is going to say, yeah, it's never wrong to do those things. That if you're acting in those lines, then you will be doing your duty. You will be respecting persons, yourself included. And a duty to do these things. These are the things that we will have duties to do if and when we consult our inner moral intuition. It's going to say, if it falls into any of these things, Ross wagers that intuition is always going to say, yeah, that's perfectly morally okay to do. Now, if it is the opposite of these things, Ross is going to wager it's going to say those are bad. You don't want to do that. Like, say that instead of trying to make previous wrongs right, we just keep generating more wrongs. Like, say that we accidentally, say that we're walking by our neighbor's car and we have something, with a sharper edge in our hand, like say a rake or some yard tool. Say we're carrying a shovel in the yard and we happen to trip and fall, and when we fall, the shovel rakes the side of our neighbor's car, their brand new car. Well, our neighbor is a person, a rational, willing, autonomous, moral agent. The first thing Ross would say is when we ask our intuition, should we tell our neighbor? Our neighbor didn't see us. We could get away with it. But the idea is, should we tell our neighbor, oh yeah, I tripped, I fell, I just scratched your new car, and I would like to make it right. I would like to pay whatever it takes to get your car repaired. Ross is going to say that our moral intuition is going to say, yep, that is a good thing. That is what you should do. Whereas if I go the other way around, I trip, I fall, I rake the side of their car with the head of the shovel, and then I'm like, ooh, well, they didn't see me, so I'll just walk away. Ross is going to wager that intuition is going to say, you did not try to make a wrong right, therefore you did wrong. So you did not respect that person, knowing that they're just like you and they're going to be displeased when they find the scratch on their car, and knowing that it costs them money and time and resources, assuming they want to get it fixed, and that's going to take from their life and their resources, and it is your action, even though accidentally, is the cause of their suffering now, and that you didn't even try to make it right. So Ross is going to say our moral intuition, that little moral intuition piece of software in all our heads across the land, is going to tell a person that is bad. You knew better. You knew the better course, which was to inform them, but you chose the worse. Therefore, you did wrong morally. And that's the way this supposedly works with Ross as a deontologist. But keep in mind, this is all about, go to their core values, respect. That is the core value. Respect all persons at all times. And these are the ways in which we could do that according to Ross. These are the ways that our intuition would tell us, yeah, these are certainly respectful behaviors here. But also some of the other core values of deontology is things like dignity. We encounter this quite a bit in the medical field. That especially with in medicine and nursing and just all forms of EMT, emergency medical, all of it, where you try to preserve the patient's dignity. That if a person has been in an accident and all of their clothes are almost torn off of them and they're laying naked in the street, the very first thing most medical personnel are going to do is to try, as long as it's not going to cause more injury, is to try to cover them up, to try to maintain that person's dignity, their modesty, to try to reposition their body, assuming it's not going to cause more injury, in a more dignified position, not have them dumped upside down, flipped upside down in the most undignified imaginable position. And it's like, remember with Ross and Kant too, but Ross especially, Ross would say our intuition, we just know this, that maintaining another person's dignity is always a good thing to do. It's like, it may not always be the first thing we do. Like I said, if moving a person in a more dignified position may injure them worse, well, we have this duty, this non-maleficence duty. And so we don't want to injure another person. And so sometimes this duty may outweigh this maintain dignity sort of duty. But it's there still. That's why a person will knock before they enter a patient's room, is that person may be involved in their own projects or their own things, and you give them a forewarning. This is what we do with other rational, willing, autonomous, moral agents, is we give people a heads up. We don't just barge in to their houses or their rooms when they're patients and just start doing whatever. That is not maintaining that person's privacy. Like, we tend to care about this as a society. Typically, is people tend to have some notion that when our privacy is invaded, that is disrespectful. That's what makes things like identity theft. That's what makes it a really poignant kind of a bad thing, is because it's not only, theft, but it violates a person's privacy, their data, their information, their financial history, all that stuff. It's like they lose their dignity. They lose their ability to keep some things private. And rational, willing, autonomous moral agents respect privacy. That having some domain that is our own, that matters. That's a supposed core value that deontology is trying to advance. Like, these core values are the sort of things that deontology is a moral theory is promoting. Anybody that's operating with these sort of deontological notions is typically going to place extreme value on these types of things. Like the ability for a person to will their own actions, to make a decision and then act on it. That's extremely valuable to a deontologist. That's part of what it means to be a person. So anytime if we do something that would hinder a person's ability to actually act on the decisions they make, to will them, then we have done something wrong. Rationality, yes, deontologists absolutely value rationality. The notion of being able to think, to decide, to critically evaluate, to analyze, all those abilities are very necessary for a deontologist. This is core to what it means to be a person, is to be rational, to be able to give and receive reasons for decisions and actions. And moreover, if you're a Kant, this rationality is like reason with a capital R up there. It's a big deal for someone like Kant. It's an extremely important value. It's what tells us what to do as far as morality goes on the Kantian picture. Also autonomy. Clearly that's going to be a big value for deontologists. Maintaining a person's ability to make informed decisions, maintaining that freedom from coercion, freedom from manipulation, maintaining a person's ability to decide for themselves. Individuality. This matters for deontologists, interestingly enough, that each and every person matters. That each individual person that is a rational, willing, autonomous moral agent, their existence matters. They're not just one bar on the bar chart like consequentialism. Consequentialism, remember, is impartial. That it doesn't really matter the individual's who someone actually is on the consequentialism picture. It just matters the effects that occurred to that person. I mean, sure, we have to take into consideration on a consequentialist picture how an action affects, well, every person in a group that is affected by it. And that means we may have to consider those special circumstances around that person. But with deontology, they put those special circumstances pride in place right out of the gate, whereas with consequentialism, we may or may not have to care. It's like if we can just determine in a general way, yeah, this person was made better off in the overall, that may be good enough. Whereas with deontology, each rational, willing, autonomous agent, each person is uniquely a person. And they matter just simply for the fact that they are a person. So individuality is there. Objectivity, yes, the objectivity comes from that notion of the same piece of software running on all human hardware across the land. And then morality, yes, deontology is a theory of morality, but even more than that, deontologists truly value doing the right thing for the simple fact that it's the right thing to do. Whereas consequentialism is kind of just a result of the calculation. We do the calculation, then we look at the results, then we act. There's no special value in doing that. It's just if we want to do If we want to behave morally, consequentialists say we do 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's the end of it. It's real straightforward. Where but there's not an special value attached to doing the right thing in consequentialism. It would only be valuable to be moral in consequentialism if that's the way that the best is secured for the most. But if in some cases acting badly actually results in the best for the most, well, then that's okay too. I mean, it would be hard for that to happen if you think to the way consequentialism actually works, but maybe it could. But either way, consequentialism doesn't necessarily put any special value on morality in and of itself, but deontologists do. That to deontologists, it actually matters whether someone's a good person or a bad person. That tends to matter to them. Also, with deontology, we can develop these hard and fast rights. Like we hear it often in contemporary society. People talk about they have a right to something. They are entitled to something. Deontology absolutely buys into those notions that rational, willing, autonomous moral agents do have rights. And those rights should never be trampled upon in any way that would be disrespectful. Now, deontologists may not think that everybody has all the rights that they think they have. I mean, would have to look case by case basis. But there is a sort of default assumption in deontology that people do have rights and they do have entitlements. They earn certain things and they are entitled to what they have earned. They also, that we have these duties, these obligations. That is a big value to deontologists. Well, that's the deon in deontology. Is that duties are of extreme value and moreover attempting to fulfill them, like actually attempting to be beneficent or to demonstrate gratitude or to make reparations in order to be more respectful to people. Yeah, that's extreme value for deontology. Truth telling, promise keeping. Essentially, what's going to be of value to a deontologist is essentially anything. Any action, character, trait, state of being that enhances, promotes, or protects the respect demonstrated between persons. If it enhances the respect that people show between each other, then it's going to be something deontology is going to value. And likewise, anything that disrespects persons is going to be an immediate disvalue to deontology. Like also irrationality, like not being reasonable, not actually someone gives us reasons and then we just don't pay attention to them because we just don't like what they're saying. Well, that would be irrational. Whereas if someone gives us reasons, we take the time to actually carefully think about what someone has said and weigh it in comparison to our own reasons. And then we decide based off of whoever has the best reasons, rather than just deciding based off, well, they gave me good reasons, but I just don't care. That would be irrational. That's a disvalue for deontology. And also for Kant, not doing what reason tells us to do. That's the epitome of being irrational on the Kantian picture. And that would be a disvalue for deontologists. Also, selfishness. Interestingly enough, even though each person matters tremendously on the deontological picture, the idea of respect immediately implies that the value is to do right by others, to demonstrate the proper amount of respect that is due to the fact that this is a person standing before me, not a shovel. And whenever I'm selfish, like the notion of selfishness is when I would treat that person as if they were a shovel or they were a tool. I treat them as a mere means to my own ends. That is selfish. That is a disvalue on the deontology picture. Or that's the way deontologists interpret selfishness. Subjectivity, yeah, it's like reason is the same or intuition is supposedly the same across all people. This is not about individuals doing whatever they think is right independent of reason or intuition. That's not what deontology is saying. What deontology is saying is that we all share in the same reason. All people, everywhere. Or we all share in the same intuition. All people, everywhere. And so when we decide to act based on intuition, we're supposedly not deciding just on what we as an individual or a subject feel is best. It's that we have to be reliant upon that intuition being the same across all people. Like all persons that were confronted with a particular situation should intuit the same things as being good or bad. Now, whether that's plausible or not, we can think about that. But that's the idea. That's why deontology is not just saying, oh yeah, individuals just decide for themselves. They're not subjectivist. They are objectivist in the sense that they buy into this notion that there's like this piece of reasoning software that's running across all humanity. Or there's this intuition software that's running across all humanity. All of humanity that is rational, that is willing, that is autonomous, that is moral, and that is agent. All the people that have those traits supposedly share in the same intuition, the same reason. And if that assumption is good, it may or may not be. Some philosophy people and ethicists have been suspicious about this claim. But if it is true that intuition is shared across all humanity, or reason is shared across all of humanity, in the sense of all humanity that is persons, understood in this way of deontology, well then, yeah, subjectivity is not really playing into it. That what a subject does or an individual does is consults their reason, and reason tells them what to do. But that same reason is in the head of this other person standing next to them, and if both people are using reason properly, according to Kant, that both would reach the same decision. Both examples of the reasoning software would dump out the same result. Just like two calculator pieces of software on two separate computers, if we type in 2 + 2 and equals, we expect to get 4 on both screens as a result. That's the way reason is supposed to work on the content picture. That's the way intuition is supposed to work on the Ross picture. So it's not about individuals just doing what they as individuals feel is best. No, it's a matter of individuals consulting this sort of, universal intuition program, or universal reason program. Yeah, and so immoral, and also lying, false promising. So any action, character trait, whatever that detracts from, harms, or destroys the respect demonstrated between persons, that's going to be a bad thing, or an unworthwhile, a disvalued thing for deontologists. So that being said, moving to their strengths, their weaknesses, well, deontology, because it's a form of moral objectivism, it inherits all the strengths of moral objectivism. Just like down here in weaknesses, it's going to inherit all the weaknesses of it. You can look back to the week with the metaethical theories and see what those strengths and weaknesses were. The strength, assuming that this reason and intuition programs, assuming it is the same in everyone, which that's a big assumption, keep in mind. But assuming that it is, then all people, once properly trained on how to use their reason and intuition, can eventually reach the same morality or immorality assessments. That's what I just described, where two people confronted with the same situation about, say, an abortion scenario, that given the context, given the facts of the case, two people using the same intuition software should reach the same determination about whether that abortion in that case, in those circumstances, was moral or immoral. Whether it maintained the respect of persons or it detracted from the respect of persons. And if it maintained it or enhanced it, it'll be morally okay. If it detracted from respect, from the amount of respect in play, then it will be labeled as bad by both people running the same intuition software or both people running the same reason program. So the idea is, we could have consensus. That is one thing deontologists, they depend on this notion that software is the same across people's minds. And people are responsible for their intentions, their motives, not the consequences of their actions. This is actually a big strength of deontology, whereas it's a potential weakness for consequentialism. That can we really control all the consequences of our actions? Deontologists say absolutely not. That all we can do is try to act the best way we know how and do what reason tells us, do what our intuition tells us, and hope for the best. But we cannot control how it actually plays out. We can have the best of intentions, good intentions, and bad consequences can follow from those things. So the consequences of our actions are outside our control in many cases. And a deontologist would say, well, we should judge the morality of actions off of what we can control, not what we can't control. Consequentialists will be the first to admit that we don't necessarily have control over the consequences of our actions, but we're still held accountable based on them. See, a consequentialist is going to hold us accountable whether we did something right or wrong is based on, how it turned out for the majority of people affected. Can we really control that? Maybe not. So we could have done our best on the consequentialist picture and still be labeled having acted immorally for things totally beyond our control. And consequentialism is like, we care more about the best for the most. It's not about the individual getting the short end of the stick, the sort of metaphorical short end of the stick. It's like having good intentions counts for nothing on the consequentialist picture. That if a person intends to do good things by someone and it turns out bad for 100,000 people, consequentialism is going to say that person, despite their intentions, they still acted immorally. Whereas on the deontological picture, they would say that 100,000 injuries, if you were acting in accordance with duty, you were acting with your sole intent was to be respectful to those people. You were doing your best to be respectful to them, even though 100,000 people were injured as a direct result of your action. You didn't do anything morally wrong. In fact, you acted morally. It just didn't turn out good. Keep that in mind. That is a huge potential strength for deontology. That if you have good intentions, regardless of the outcomes, you still did a good thing on deontology. Whereas with consequentialism, if you had good intentions but it turned out bad for the most, you did a bad thing regardless of what you intended to do. That's a huge difference between these two theories. And it's a potential significant strength on deontology. That we can, the morality of our actions is based off what we intended to do. If we intended to be respectful to persons, even though the action resulted in disrespect, if our intention was good, our action was good. Whereas with consequentialism, if the results are bad, our action was bad, regardless of what we intended. I've said that in many ways so that people can get a real good sense of that. That's a big difference between these two. And so the next thing is it seems to fit well with many people's intuitions about morality or immorality. Well, doesn't it? That how many people in the class have kind of been thinking, this sounds right. That we should be respectful to other people. And perhaps that is what's crucial to morality and ethics, is this notion of respect to others. and to try to always give people the respect that is due to them. And when we don't do that, we've done something morally bad. If your intuition is kind of gone that way, well, then that's a strength of deontology, is it grabs people's intuitions. Yeah, like always being maximally respectful of other people. That's a good thing, right? It is for, that's what deontology would want you to think. And if you think that, then, well, it has intuitive appeal. That's a strength of a theory for people to actually be kind of where they buy into what the theory is saying. Then the next thing is it paves the theoretical and practical way for notions like inalienable and legal rights. Yeah, that's something that's really neat to think about. We hear that notion of these inalienable rights to like life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Those are supposed, the inalienable, meaning can never be taken away, should never be trampled on, should never be hindered. Deontology can be all for things like that. And it can support things like that on the grounds that they demonstrate respect for persons. Why is an inalienable right a good thing? Because it demonstrates the proper amount of respect for persons, rational, willing, autonomous agents. Whereas with consequentialism, keep in mind that nothing's off the table, that no rights are inalienable, meaning unremovable. With consequentialism, rights could be given, taken away, just based off what is deemed to be the best for the most at any given time and place and situation. That nothing is permanent in a consequentialist picture besides that sort of overarching idea of always do the best for the most, whatever that involves. If that means using some people as mere means to that end, consequentialism is fine with that. But remember, deontologists are not fine with that. We don't use people as tools to some larger social ends on deontology. That would be disrespectful to them. Big difference between the two. So people who like the notions of rights, whatever that happens to mean, deontologists can absolutely support those notions. And then also deontology, one of its biggest strengths is it's already present. As I use like those medical examples, it's absolutely the notion of respecting a patient's dignity, autonomy, their rationality, their ability to make decisions on their own, then will those decisions into action. Those are huge things in medicine of any form. And also in legal situations, that's where the notion of someone being liable comes into play. All the civil cases and criminal cases, a lot of these lawsuit cases are about a situation where supposedly one person acted in a way that caused harm to another person, say financially, and that the only respectful route is for the one who caused the damage to pay the other person back, to make reparations. You see how deontology is totally consistent with that idea of lawsuits and things like that, to try to make amends for injuries and wrongs done. Yeah, big in legal situations. Deontology and its concepts are extremely prevalent, and especially in civil cases and in criminal too. The weaknesses. Deontology inherits all the weaknesses of moral objectivism. That's kind of a given. But it's not simple. That's one of the big weaknesses of deontology, is that it's not always easy to figure out how to respect somebody, or how do we respect all people involved in a situation all at the same time? How do we resolve conflicts? Well, we can consult reason and intuition. That's what the deontologists are going to tell us to do. And that's going to be their response too, that it's not always easy nor straightforward, but the deontology people are going to say, yeah, our reason and intuition, though, should give us the answer if we keep asking it enough. Does that seem plausible? I don't know, but we'll have the opportunity to deal with this during this week's discussion. This notion of respect and how it actually may manifest itself, and can we respect all the people all of the time? Remember, consequentialism, it starts on the assumption that it's normally not possible to make all people happy all of the time. Whereas deontology seems to start on the assumption that it is possible to always respect all people all of the time. Potential weakness there. We'll see during this week's discussion. Also, deontology is not yet empirical. I suppose it is possible that as we do more science, that this notion of reason, like, it could be tested whether everyone, and there has been studies on things like this, by the way. They may not have been talking about like Kant's notion of reason, but there has been lots of psychological and neurological research on similarities across human minds. And might it in fact be that we could test to see if everybody has the same moral intuition software lying in there, buried in their subconscious or conscious? Maybe one day, but not today. So as of today, deontology is not empirical. It is not an empirical theory. It is not really testable via experimentation. You can do thought experiments. You can get a bunch of people together, propose a situation to them, and see how their intuition goes. But if anything, like last week's discussion of the trolley problem and the videos we saw about that should give a good insight in that sometimes people, their intuition doesn't seem to line up. So if anything, the data would indicate what empirical data there does seem to be is that there would seem to be data to support that maybe there's not this universal reason software or universal intuition software. If there's not, then deontology really will not have given us a way to determine the morality of actions, which means it fails as a moral theory. That's a big deal. That's a real big deal in terms of a moral ethical theory. But maybe it does. But without the data, without the empiricism, without the science behind it, some people see deontology as a return to this sort of gushy, squishy, non-observable, non-testable, inside-the-head stuff. Some ethicists would be, this is a great big yuck. Because consequentialism gives us something that everybody can observe, namely the consequences. We can see that, and test that. Whereas testing intuition and reason, that's a little more challenging at the moment because, we don't have neuroscience totally worked out. Psychological science is not totally worked out. They're not complete, finished. And so we don't have the same level of rigor that can be applied in consequentialism to these deontological claims. It's like if a consequentialist claims that a particular action was moral, we can test that. We can say, okay, well, show me your data. And then I'll run the consequence calculations, see if my numbers match yours. If they do, then yeah, you made the accurate assessment. And we could do this across millions of people and have millions of people making the same assessment. And the data would be there. The consequences are observable. They're the results of actions. I mean, we can actually see the level of bodily injury, maybe an action caused across how many people. We can see how many people lost money based on a decision to an action. We can count that stuff up. And so with consequentialism, there is a definitive way to reach an answer. We may not buy into consequentialism, but it does give us a way to get to an answer and determine whether something was right or wrong based on, its assumption of what's the most good is the best for the most. But with deontology, what do we do when two people's intuitions don't align? Well, Ross is going to, W.D. Ross, the deontologist, would say that those two people would need to talk to each other, and he wagers that if they keep talking long enough, their intuitions will harmonize. And that maybe one of them wasn't properly consulting intuition, and that could be worked out in the wash through debate, discussion, etc. And maybe Ross is right about that. Maybe that is the case, but that's a little more gushy squishy than consequentialism, and so that can be a weakness, depending on, do we expect our moral theories to actually give us answers to questions about specific actions. If we do, and so we can verify it ourselves, then it's a lot more difficult road on this deontology picture than on consequentialism. It seems to be, at least. But people can think about that and decide for themselves if that's really a yuck or not. It may not be. And then I've already said this, that reason and intuition may not be nearly as universal across all people as Scott and Ross assume. And that's a big one. If it's not, then deontology will have failed to provide us an answer to that second question, like, is there a way to reliably determine the morality and morality of an action? Deontology is supposed to have provided us with an answer, but if the way it is provided us is not actually legitimate, then that's a big theoretical problem. It's a big practical problem. It's a practical problem for the theory. That's the way to say it. And then some people would say consequences do matter, don't they? Deontology, remember, we go back to this picture. The deontologists say that we don't have to worry about these things. These consequences of our actions, we can't control all of those. And so instead, when we're trying to figure out the morality of this action, we look at the desires, the motives, intent, the duties that are in play, and whether a person was acting, trying to do their duty, trying to respect people. And as long as that was in play, then a person's action, the morality doesn't depend on the results. But here's a scenario. Say that you have a pharmaceutical company that they're trying to develop a cure for a very common childhood ailment. This ailment kills or makes miserable lots of little children every year. And everybody working for that pharmaceutical company, they're actually genuinely doing their best to show respect to people and trying to fulfill their duty. What would it be? Which one of these would it be? Beneficence. That's what it would be. They're trying to do right by all of these parents of these children and the children themselves. But remember, the children aren't necessarily persons yet, but their parents are. And so imagine this pharmaceutical company is trying to demonstrate the utmost respect for persons and trying to develop this new wonder drug to help little children. And say that it goes through the various trials, like medical drug testing trials and the drug test trials, and it goes through FDA trials, and it's FDA approved. And in the trials, there was a fraction, like a milli% of some children that had a negative reaction to the treatment, the medication, or the drug that was developed. And so all of their indications, they had the right intent, they had good intentions. They were doing their best to help other persons and other potential persons in the form of children. I mean, they were doing their best. They had good intentions. They were acting with a good will. Their reason and intuition said, yes, it's not contradictory to do this, and moreover, it's great if you were to do this. And they chose to do that. And so they did everything in their power to do the best they could by persons. And yet, regardless of the lab testing, that medication is released into in the child population, and say 150,000 children die within a week. Consequentialists are going to say the amount of suffering that happened for the majority in that situation, a consequentialist is almost surely going to say that that pharmaceutical company, regardless of good intentions, regardless of acting out of a sense of duty, they did something wrong, and they should be held accountable for those 100,000 deaths. They acted immorally. Why? Well, look at all the dead kids. That, and the majority, all the parents and all of these people negatively impacted by this. Any parents of the children that died, all of those had a tremendous negative consequence. And so the situation, according to a consequentialist, would probably be all of these children. The majority was made worse off by this pharmaceutical company's action. It doesn't matter that they had good intention. They still did something morally wrong. The deontologist, on the other hand, though, would say that they had the good intent, they had goodwill, they tried to do the best, in terms of respecting all persons and potential persons. The pharmaceutical company didn't do anything morally wrong. They did a morally right action. It's just unfortunate they cannot perfectly control the consequences. So sorry to those 150,000 parents and those dead children, but we didn't do anything morally wrong. Now, remember, the deontology person is going to say that pharmaceutical people should be willing to make reparations. They should be willing to do whatever is necessary to try to right that wrong, which, some wrongs you can't ever perfectly right. You can't bring the dead children back, but they can try to make amends to all the people, all the persons negatively affected. Deontologists are going to say they should certainly try to do that. But the difference is, in terms of assessment of their action of releasing that drug into the market, is a consequentialist would very likely label that action as immoral because of all those dead children and parents, the majority, the hit that happened to the majority of people affected. Whereas the deontologist is going to say, no, that company did nothing wrong. They were perfectly moral, and we should never hesitate to give that company more money because they're trying to do the right thing. So they should still continue to get research grants. They should still remain in business. We should still support their endeavors from on and on, even though there's these 150,000 dead children. See? Consequentialists are going to say, consequences do matter, don't they? Deontologists are like, well, yeah, only to the extent that we should make reparations sometimes. But in this case, that company didn't technically do anything morally wrong on the deontology picture, so they really don't have a wrong to right. Think about that. That could be a potential weakness. Also, this deontology tends to have this sort of scattershot approach or effect that there could be potential many value conflicts with this. When you're trying to figure out how to respect all these people, all persons at all times, different people, because they are rational, willing, autonomous, the very notion of rationality and autonomy imply that people can have their own values they develop for themselves, their own life plans, their own things that they consider most worthwhile and worth pursuing. And a deontologist is always going to instruct us that we have to respect those things. But the idea is, how do we respect all sorts of values that people may have at any given time? It can be, this is what makes deontology not nearly as simple as consequentialism to work with. And we will see that, as I've alluded to in this week's discussion. There can be value conflicts that just show up, and it's like, how do you respect everybody involved? It's not always completely straightforward. But we'll see. Maybe it is. Maybe deontology is more straightforward than most philosophy people and ethicist people tend to think. Everyone in here can decide that for themselves. You can think about the way deontology works and work with it this week. And throughout the semester, we'll encounter many deontologic based arguments. And we'll see as we go through the semester. Always keep in mind that when I list these things as strengths and weaknesses, that these are just like working sort of operational notions. That something that is a weakness could actually be a strength, and something that's a strength could be a weakness. It just depends on how we interpret it at a given time with a theory, or an argument. And that these are just the sort of standard things that you'd encounter in any presentation of like deontology as a theory, or as I did with consequentialism. These strengths and these weaknesses are just the common things that, others have come up with throughout time. But some of these things that some is perceived as a strength could actually be a weakness, and vice versa. It's just something to keep in mind about this. I mean, the idea is not for people to just take this when in practice, one kind of thinks for themselves in terms of, is a theory strong in one way or weak in another way. But the structure of deontological arguments is essentially the same kind of thing as consequentialism. For deontology, it's like, if action X is performed in accordance with one's duties, then it's moral. Action X was in fact performed in accordance with one's duties, well, thus it would be moral. That's how a deontologist can craft an argument. But notice that performed in accordance with one's duties, premise one just assumes that deontology as a moral theory is true. And so its strength or weakness is whatever the strength and weaknesses of deontology are. A person that makes an argument like this would need to defend deontology from the potential weaknesses that may be relevant to the particular action that's under discussion. And then in the second thing, action X was performed in accordance with one's duties. That's the tricky bit with deontology, because all you can really do is, how do we establish that premise 2 or the second reason is actually true, as we'd have to consult reason and intuition. And if our reason or intuition isn't returning the same result as the deontologist making the argument, well, what do we do? Well, according to Ross, we'd have to talk to them and work that out. But that may or may not, like, we can't just do this on our own typically. This premise 2, it requires actually engaging with the people writing the argument. And then for an immoral judgment of an action, that's how it works right there. So what is the take-home message? After these past 3 weeks, we've looked at the meta-ethical positions, moral relativism, etc. We have looked at consequentialism and deontology. The first message is, despite the weaknesses I mentioned and talked about throughout these weeks, none of these theoretical positions or theories, none of them are defeated yet. They're still in play. People use them all the time, every day. Despite their weaknesses, they are still used. And so none have been defeated. And they probably won't be because they do seem to be helpful. Keep in mind, that is another take-home message. These theories, despite their weaknesses, do give us an insight into walking up to a value conflict, an ethical moral value conflict, and the argumentation that occurs during that time. Now we have the ability to look at what people are saying and say, okay, is that person assuming a particular meta-ethical position? Is that person arguing like a consequentialist? Or is that person arguing like a deontologist? If we can identify that, we immediately have a way into their argumentation. We know this now that we're familiar with the strengths, the weaknesses of all these things. We have many more tools to approach otherwise near just horrifically complicated situations. And fortunately for us, most ethical, moral value conflicts, these always appear within it. Or notions that really matter, like the core values. Like, say that we come across a scenario where like privacy is at stake. Well, that value, like say that privacy is considered valuable. Well, we could make a consequentialist argument for it, or a deontological argument for it, or we may be able to make a consequentialist counter argument against whatever someone's trying to claim about privacy, the value of privacy, or we can make a deontological counter argument against what they're trying to claim about privacy. It's like we have more tools now. That's one of the take-home messages why we've been doing this over these past few weeks. Is this gives us tools that we'll see throughout the semester. We'll use them. And that's one of the tremendous strengths about the theories is they do make inroads into making sense of what might actually be at stake in various ethical and moral value conflicts. They're tools. It's easier to drive nails if you have at least one hammer than if you have nothing except your hand or a little dinky river rock. And these theories can be like really helpful hammers sometimes, to use a metaphor here. Also, another take-home message is these meta-ethical positions and theories, as is the last time I'll mention it, they are everywhere. And now that we've been exposed to them, you'll be able to see them in your everyday life and jobs. Hopefully, if you stop and think about it, especially if there's some ethical, moral, or some value conflict occurs, try to think about it like a consequentialist would or a deontologist would. I can promise you, if you start doing that and you talk to another person about it, they will immediately, even though they may not know what, consequentialism or deontology, they will immediately be able to get on board with you and at least think the same way you're thinking. Because the ideas that we have surveyed these past few weeks, they're everywhere. They're all over the place. Also, now that we've seen the positions, the meta-ethical positions, as well as the two big theories, there are more. Keep in mind, consequentialism and deontology are not the only two moral theories. There is virtue ethics, there's care ethics, there's a lot of other kind of theories. We have just picked these two. I selected them, consequentialism, deontology, because they tend to be the ones that are most commonly in play. And so we have limited time in a given semester, and we can't survey all of them, like natural law, virtue, care ethics, but you're more than welcome to read about those on your own time. There are excerpts in our textbook from these, all three of them. So you're more than welcome to read about those and do more internet research, more book research. You can ask me about them. I'll be glad to help you. But typically, everyday people, what are they actually going to be? What makes ethics difficult is the reality that most everyday people tend to be moral mishmash when it comes to the meta-ethical positions. I mentioned that during the week we talked about them. That means there's a sort of grab bag of all kinds of things that they can be drawing on and think they answer to. They can think they answer to a divine being in some situations, and the same person in another situation could think they answer to their peers, and in another situation that same person could think, oh, I just answer to me and me alone in this situation. So that's very, very common with typical people. And also, typical people will be mixed hybrids. They'll use some of consequentialism and some of deontology. What a mess. This is what makes, like, if you ever had a suspicion that ethical and moral debates tend not to be resolved, and that they tend to go on and on and on, and people keep talking about them, and you ever wondered, why is that? Why is that? It's not because we don't have theories that'll give you an answer. Consequentialism, we have seen consequentialism can give answers. But people tend not to be pure consequentialists. People tend to be some deontological notions too. Consequento deont hybrids. That's a real nasty sort of hyphenated word I just made up because that's a really sort of rough way that people happen to be. I mean, it's the way people are. I'm not saying it's bad to be this way. It's just that given that many of us are this way, the same people we run into value conflicts with are this way too. And this is why it's extremely challenging sometimes to arrive on any kind of agreement. This is why some people can disagree forever. But the hope with a class like this one is that we practice so that we become more adept at navigating these snarling messes that we're going to encounter. And we'll encounter one during this week's discussion. And what do? It's a situation of being able to think through. And if we're aware of all the things that people may be assuming at any given time and we know what to look for, we have a lot more tools than we did walking into this class. We have gained something. So that's one of the take-home messages. Just be aware that much of what you'll encounter in everyday life is a big mixed mess of all the stuff we've been talking about. One person holding pieces of all these notions at the same time and not necessarily checking which pieces are consistent with which other pieces. And yet they're still saying something. They're still making claims about the rightness or wrongness of actions. Just think about that. Quite a challenge to deal with. Okay, and that's that is why. That's the big reason of why have we spent the time looking at these things, because we need help. We need tools, we need inroads into a world where most people are mishmashed of all this stuff we've been talking about. But now that we've seen each of the pieces separate, maybe the thought is by seeing each of these metaethical positions separate, seeing consequentialism in a pure form, deontology in a more pure form, that we can recognize when aspects of all of these things are in play, when a person's giving us reasons and they're trying to provide us with an argument. We can find that, and then that helps us analyze their reasons better, and to actually be able to understand what they may be assuming so we can talk to them and resolve stuff. A few comments about this week's textbook readings. This week there's excerpts from Immanuel Kant, and then there is a little article by Nora O'Neill. Nora O'Neill, her article just describes like this part of Kant, this end in itself, the second part of how reason works, which is really helpful. And then the other part is just Kant, where Kant talks about all of this notion and the goodwill, reasons, maxims. His writing is, it was written in German in 1700s. So it was written at a time when sentence structure was not quite the same as it is today. So if you start reading the Kant stuff, hopefully now, after being exposed to deontology, what's going on, seeing the big picture as it is, then you should be able to make sense of Kant and be able to walk through it. But if all else fails, you can always go back to that philosophical pattern of inquiry and ask, well, what question is Kant trying to answer at any given place? Like, pick a paragraph that you're trying to understand and then ask, what question is this paragraph trying to answer? What is Kant's answer to that question? What reasons does Kant offer for that answer? And you can do that paragraph by paragraph. That's the helpfulness of that philosophical pattern of inquiry. And we'll be seeing much more of it in the weeks to come. But that's how to use it on this week's textbook readings. Use it to your advantage. Let that pattern of inquiry help you walk through the Kant excerpts that we'll be reading this week in the textbook. Yeah, and that is pretty much all there is to say about deontology for the moment. But I look forward to this week's discussion. I'll talk with everyone there.